Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ed Juregin, the founding director of the Baker Institute, and I want to warmly welcome you this evening to the Baker Institute. Something must be happening to the economy to have this crowd here tonight. I don't know what it may be. We are certainly pleased to host the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour at such a critical time in our nation's history. Currently, to state the obvious, our country is in the midst, and the world is in the midst of a major financial crisis, and we are facing a staggering long-run fiscal imbalance. This fiscal imbalance threatens to significantly reduce the standard of living of future generations. And I know we're all thinking about our children and our grandchildren, not only ourselves, as we look at the panoply of problems our country is facing. And it could potentially impair our ability as a nation to pursue our national security interests abroad. No country can take a leadership role internationally if its economy is not strong. The financial crisis and subsequent economic turmoil has elevated issues related to taxes and expenditures to the forefront of public debate. And it's very important when we think of taxes to think of expenditures. That's why we've called our Baker Institute program a tax and expenditure program. Too often, it is only a discussion of taxes and not expenditures. The two go together. So the issues related to taxes and expenditures to the forefront of our public debate is made as policymakers have attempted to combat the crisis by expansionary monetary and fiscal policies. Although the federal government has already approved over $3 trillion in stimulus spending, our country remains in the midst of a deep recession. Last week's inauguration of President Obama ushers in a new period and a new group of policymakers who are crafting their economic stimulus package. Hopefully, our political leaders on both sides of the aisle can move forward with meeting these daunting fiscal and economic challenges in a bipartisan manner. President Obama has indicated he would like to reduce taxes for the middle class and drastically increase government spending on infrastructure. However, the United States government's long-term balance sheet is more than $53 trillion in the red, and any new policies aimed at increasing government spending and reducing government revenue via tax cuts needs to be approached wisely. Accordingly, tonight's program focuses on the importance and necessity of governmental fiscal restraint. The Fiscal Wake-Up Tour aims to educate the public by holding open forums, as we're having here this evening, on the long-term consequences of continuing on a path of fiscal irresponsibility and to elicit change in Washington through a grassroots effort. We are honored to have a number of distinguished speakers this evening, including David Walker, the President and CEO of Peter G. Peterson Foundation. As Comptroller General of the United States and head of the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, from 1998 to 2008, spanning both Democratic and Republican administrations, Mr. Walker served as the federal government's chief auditor. I'm very tempted, David, to tell the story about the Iraq Study Group, but I think I will tell it. David Walker can be a really tough guy. When Secretary Baker and Lee Hamilton co-chaired the Iraq Study Group, I was a senior policy advisor to the group, so the first witness that we had was David Walker. And so David Walker walks into the room. You have all these prominent Democrats and Republicans, and as part of the Iraq Study Group, and he says, now what I have to say is secret, is classified secret. So I just assume that you all have a secret clearance. So Secretary Baker looks around, he says, anyone here without a secret clearance? Well, my clearance hadn't come through yet. And so I meekly raised my hand, and the other man who raised his hand was Edwin Meese, the former Attorney General of the United States. So both of us had to sheepishly leave the room while David gave this first briefing. Anyway, I'm digressing. We are also privileged to be joined by Robert Bixby, the Executive Director of the Concord Coalition, Will Marshall, President and founder of the Progressive Policy Institute, and Brian Rydell, Senior Policy Analyst of the Heritage Foundation. The discussion will be moderated by our John Diamond, the Baker Institute's Edward A. and Herminia Hancock Kelly Fellow in Tax and Expenditure Policy. I'm sure you will find that tonight's important deliberations could not be timelier and more relevant to our deliberations. Join me in inviting John Diamond to the podium.
Thank you for coming. I'm not going to take up any more time, as I'm just thrilled that we have these gentlemen here to speak to us. So let's start with Robert Bixby.
Well, I don't have any state secrets to talk about. I wish these were state secrets in a way. I guess they're open information, and people still don't do anything about it. So on the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour, we talk a lot about stewardship. Stewardship is a word that you don't often associate with the federal budget, but that needs to change. The federal budget, which is now more than $3 trillion, is not just a collection of numbers. It's actually a statement of our national priorities. And more importantly, it reflects a vision of how we see our place in the world and the place that we would like to see and the opportunities we would like to have for future generations. Because the decisions that we make now are going to have a critical effect on the opportunities and the world that our children and grandchildren will live in 20 and 30 years from now. And so it's time that the American people and our elected officials face a stark reality, and that is that our economic future is at risk. The federal budget is largely on autopilot, and the pre-programmed course is unsustainable. Unless we do something to alter that reality, we're going to be facing economic challenges even greater than what we're seeing now, or a slow, steady decline in our nation's standard of living. Neither one of those would be an acceptable exercise of our stewardship responsibility. Today, of course, the main focus in Washington is about the short-term crisis, and that's perfectly understandable, and you would expect that they would want to direct their attentions on correcting the financial sector crisis and addressing the recession. But we can't afford to focus only on the present. We need to appreciate the magnitude of the long-term fiscal challenge, the importance of making trade-offs, and the importance of acting sooner rather than later. Deficits have traditionally been caused by things like we're seeing now, a slow economy, war, and then those issues fade away and the budget returns to some sort of balance. Well, there's a big difference now, and it's that big difference that we've been talking about on the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour for the last couple of years. The big difference is that we're on the verge of a demographic transformation to an older society, and we're making that transformation with the backdrop of falling national savings and rising health care costs. That is all a very dangerous combination for the future health of the economy. Let's just look at a few things where we are now. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, the three largest federal entitlement programs, currently comprise over 42% of the federal budget. We've got that little wedge in there because there's a lot of extra money right now for the TARP spending that sort of skews things off. But the basic point is that we have a very large percentage of our federal budget which is already committed to the three largest entitlement programs, and the boomers have only just they're on the very verge of retirement. The first ones qualified for Social Security early retirement just last year. So now let's apply certain dynamics to that situation. One is demographics. We are an aging population. That is a good thing because people are living longer. That's certainly, as President Clinton used to call it, a high-class problem. But the percentage of the population age 65 and over is going to go from about 13% where it is now to around 20% over the next 25 years. But it's not just demographics alone that's driving the long-term fiscal future. Healthcare costs have tended to rise faster than the economy and faster than revenues for the past 40 years. If you look at the future and say, what happens if healthcare costs continue to grow relative to the size of the economy at the same rate that they have for the past 40 years? Keep that trend going. You would find that just two programs, Medicare and Medicaid, would absorb as much of our nation's resources as the entire federal budget does today. Now, that is an unsustainable trend, and other speakers are going to talk a little bit about what that trend portends for the future. I'd like to just drop back now and give you a little bit of grounding on where the current federal budget is. What we have here is a projection for the end of the current fiscal year that we're in, and you can see that the deficit is projected to be $1.2 trillion. That would be a record by any measure, more than double last year's budget deficit, and much higher even as a percentage of the economy, about 8% of the economy, than we have had as a post-World War II record. But the thing that I would like you to focus on here is that red bar at the top of the spending column, the $195 billion. That's how much was spent or is projected to be spent this year on interest on the national debt. That's a huge amount of money. It is more than we are spending in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. It's about as much as we're spending, the federal government contributes to the Medicaid program. And as we continue to run large budget deficits, and remember we're borrowing now at very low interest rates, that will tend to go up. Now this is the economist chart. I like to show this, even though I'm not an economist, but I mean, this is kind of the playing field. When you look at the federal budget, it's good to measure these things against some sort of standard rather than just dollar figures alone. So measured against the size of our economy, GDP, we have tended to spend at about 20% of GDP at the federal level and tax at about 18% of GDP at the federal level. You can see how astronomical the changes have been this year to throw those numbers way out of whack. But again, if we were going to continue to spend at about 20% and tax at about 18%, I would say the budget deficit was too high, but we probably wouldn't be out doing a fiscal wake-up tour. The other speakers will talk about what the projections show under current law if we do nothing. One thing that is new is we're borrowing a great deal from abroad because we don't save enough domestically, and so as we run these big budget deficits, over 50% of our debt held by the public is now held by foreign investors. And of course, as I said, we're borrowing at very low interest rates now. When the economy recovers, when it begins to pick up, interest costs to the federal government for rolling over that debt could really go through the roof. So we are not the gloom and doom tour. That is Paul Revere on the horse. He is our symbol. We're spreading an alarm because we have faith that the American people and their elected officials can deal with these problems. We don't agree on the right mix of spending, taxes, and debt. There's different perspectives on our traveling roadshow, but we all agree wherever you're coming from, current fiscal policy is unsustainable. There are no easy answers like cutting waste, fraud, and abuse or growing our way out of the problem. We're going to have to reach bipartisan cooperation. We're going to have a willingness to consider all options. Public engagement is very, very important, which is why we're outside the Beltway. We can't have another bill like the TARP bill where the public feels that they didn't have any say and don't understand what's going on. But most importantly, this is not about numbers, even though we bludgeon you to death with numbers. This is really, for us, is a moral issue about the legacy that we're leaving for future generations. And right now, my generation, the baby boomers, is failing that stewardship test. Now, one guy that does not fail the stewardship test is our next speaker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, David Walker. Dave has been described by the Washington Post as the rock star of the fiscal wake-up tour. So for all of you that thought that an accountant, a CPA, could never be a rock star, you're wrong. He can be. Here's Dave Walker.
It's good to be back in Houston. I lived in Houston from 1978 to early 1981, and to tell you how much it's evidence of that is that we're going to NINFAS after tonight's. So I've got to get back to NINFAS if I come back to Houston. I'd like to talk to you about where we've been, where we are, where we're headed, but let me preface it with the fact that we're at a critical crossroads in the history of this country, and that the decisions that are made or fail to be made within the next 5 years will have a profound effect on what our future position will be in the world, what our future standard of living will be like in the future. And that for the first time in the history of this country, we're in a position where the next generation may not have as good a life as we had. And that is not American. The American dream is to provide more opportunity to the next generation and to leave things better off for each generation. And that dream is at risk. And we're on the road to try to make sure that we can restore that dream and to keep America strong. So let's keep these numbers in mind. In the last 40 years, the composition of the federal government has changed dramatically, from being dominated by defense to being dominated by social insurance programs. In the last 40 years, the percentage of the budget that Congress gets to decide each year how to spend the money has declined dramatically, from 2/3 of the budget in 1968 to 39% in 2008. And guess what? Those of you that are connoisseurs of the Constitution, which I try to be, if you look at the express and enumerated responsibilities that the Founding Fathers envisioned for the United States federal government, you will find that every express and enumerated responsibility is in that 39%, and it's getting squeezed. We're doing two things today. We're mortgaging the future of our children and grandchildren, and we're reducing our investments in their future. Either one is bad. A combination is terrible. As of September 30, 2008, the total liabilities and unfunded promises for Social Security and Medicare alone amounted to $56.4 trillion. There are 12 zeros to the right of that 56, without pennies, up from 20 trillion at the end of 2000. So in 8 years, we went from a little over 20 trillion to a little over $56 trillion. And this number goes up by 2 to 3 trillion every year on autopilot, even with a balanced budget. And needless to say, we're a long way away from a balanced budget, and we're headed in the wrong direction fast. Now, I don't know about you, but $56 trillion is a lot of money, and therefore it's a little bit difficult to comprehend. So let me give you some metrics to try to put it in perspective. $56.4 trillion as of September 30, 2008 was 99% of the estimated net worth of every American household. And guess what has happened since September 30, 2008? Markets have gone down, housing prices have gone down, deficits have exploded, bailouts have proliferated, and so therefore, for the first time in the history of the United States, America now owes more than Americans are worth, and the gap is growing. $56.4 trillion is $483,000 per household. Median household income in America, $48,000. So the typical American household under our do-nothing, status quo, let-it-ride path has a second or third mortgage, implicit mortgage, equal to 10 times their annual income, but no house to back the mortgage. This is what our future looks like under a status quo path where we tax at historical levels and where we don't reform Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and where the rest of the federal budget, defense, homeland security, education, transportation, etc., represents the same relative size of the economy that it does today. This is obviously not an acceptable scenario where the line is revenues, the bar is spending, and the fastest growing expense is interest on the monumental federal debt. And by the way, this is without considering an increase in interest rates, and I can assure you, interest rates will go up when you try to borrow the amount of money that we're going to be going to the world to try to borrow. This is what the past and the future looks like, debt as a percentage of the economy. For many, many years in the history of our country, we had a history of not adding significant debt levels except for recessions, depressions, and war. And we took steps to lessen the burden as quickly as we could. But now we've become addicted to debt. We're running deficits and debt in good time and bad, and then when the economy gets soft, when we have a war, then they escalate. There's never a good time. We're always in the soup. That obviously can't be continued. And now we're to the point where today, over half of our debt held by the public is held by foreign lenders. China, Japan, OPEC nations. That is not prudent over time from an economic, foreign policy, national security, or even domestic tranquility standpoint. And one of the reasons it's that way is because we don't save. We're great at spending, we don't save enough. We're dead last among industrialized nations in savings. And savings represent the future. The United States is a great country, and we're number one in many things. But when you look at a whole range of outcome-based indicators on these blue areas below, on average, we're 17 out of 28 for an industrialized nation on results. As a certified public accountant, I can tell you, 17 out of 28 is below average. We can and we must do better. We can reform Social Security and must. We can reform our healthcare system, our tax system. We must reimpose statutory budget controls. We must re-engineer the base of government to make it focused on the future rather than the past, to make sure it's results-oriented, and we need to have extraordinary processes in place to make these things happen sooner rather than later, because Washington is badly broken, it's out of touch, it's out of control. This is not just about numbers, it's about values, and I'll give you a value: stewardship. Not just generating results today, not just leaving things better off when we leave them when we come, but leaving things better positioned for the future. We've gone so far, I couldn't even find it in Webster's dictionary. And lastly, it's about people. These are my 3 grandchildren. This is what it's about for me. It's not what we're doing for them as a country, it's what we're doing to them. They didn't cause this problem, but they will bear the burden. They will pay the price if our elected officials don't start earning their pay. And we're going to do everything that we can to make sure that they do. Thank you.
Next, we'll have Brian Riedel.
Hi, my name is Brian Riedel. I'm from the Heritage Foundation. Before I get started, the same PowerPoint you see there is also available on your chair right here if you want to follow along that way as well. I'm going to briefly summarize the problem and then show why entitlement reform is really the only option to digging us out of our financial hole. First, to put this challenge in context, there's a lot of concerns over the $800 billion stimulus that Congress is on the verge of enacting. By comparison, if you think that's a lot of money, David mentioned that the long-term challenge we face is $56 trillion. That is 70 times larger than the size of the stimulus package that's about to pass. 70 times bigger. And that's why we're talking about the long-term problem instead of just the short-term stimulus and economic problem. As well, for context, The federal government last year spent $25,117 per household. Raise your hand if you got your money's worth. Oh, some, but not many. And that's not even counting the stimulus, which will add $6,700 per household into the laps of our children and grandchildren. But if you think that's a lot of money, just wait. The crux of the problem, the challenge we face, is that 77 million baby boomers have begun retiring. And when you combine 77 million baby boomers retiring with longer lifespans, you see the ratio of workers paying the benefits to retirees falling. In 1960, 5 workers paid the taxes to support the Social Security and Medicare benefits for each retiree. Today, 3 workers pay the taxes to support the benefits of each retiree, and by 2030, 2 workers will pay the taxes to support each retiree. Now, to put a 2-to-1 ratio in context, imagine a boy and a girl born today in 2009. In 2030, they marry and start a family. They will have to support themselves, their children, and the benefits of their very own retiree. That is an immense burden to put on a family starting out. Now, in addition to the demographic tsunami we face, Medicare must also deal with the problem of rising healthcare costs every year. That means that Medicare is in a much deeper hole than Social Security. You not only have demographics, you have rising healthcare on top of it. Medicaid factors into the equation because Medicaid ends up financing a lot of the long-term care costs. So when you put it all together, those 3 programs' costs are going to grow. So to put it in econ geek speak, this is how much these 3 programs spend as a percentage of the economy. Between now and 2050, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid will go from 8.4% of the total economy to 18.6%. Now, the GDP is the sum of all income produced and spent in America each year. So at 18.6% of GDP, that means nearly $1 out of every $5 spent in America by anyone will be spent by Washington on these 3 programs. Also notice that the red expansion is a lot bigger than the blue expansion. Again, that's Medicare, a much bigger problem than Social Security because of rising healthcare costs. So you see that red wedge grows a lot more than the blue wedge. So what do we do about it? How do we pay for this 10% of GDP increase in the cost of these 3 programs? Well, option 1 would be to just raise taxes every year. If we committed to raising taxes every single year to pay for these programs, we would have to raise taxes by that full 10.2% of GDP. How big is that? Well, today, 10.2% of GDP would come to $12,000 per household. That's adjusted for inflation and adjusted for rising incomes. That's how much you'd have to raise taxes just to pay all promised benefits. And repealing the Bush tax cuts only gets you 1/10 of the way there. That's how big of a tax increase we would need. Marginal tax rates would have to more than double. We would have to raise tax rates to European standards or levels, which would probably cause significant slowdown in economic growth. So we probably don't want to raise taxes this much. There's a second option. We could just start cutting other programs. There's a lot of waste in the budget, and I'm sure we can just start chopping away every year at other programs to make room. The problem is, you couldn't cut enough to make room for the growth of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. If you started cutting other programs, by 2030, you would have had to have eliminated everything but defense. By 2049, the Pentagon is gone. And by that point, 100% of the federal budget would have to go to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. There wouldn't be a nickel for defense, education, Homeland Security, veterans, transportation, anti-poverty programs, nothing. Clearly, this is unimaginable, yet this is the path we're on. Okay, so we can't tax our way out of this, and we can't just cut waste, fraud, and abuse and solve the problem. I guess we could just keep running budget deficits. That would be a third option. The problem is, if you start to borrow that entire 10% of GDP gap, you create such a massive debt that interest rates go up, which causes you to have to borrow more to cover the higher interest costs, which cause interest rates to go up more, and pretty much the economic models collapse in the 2030s, 2040s. You just can't borrow all of this money. So we can't tax our way out of it, we can't cut enough other programs, and we can't run budget deficits. The only other option, modernize Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Reform is the only way to avoid the scenarios listed above, and every year of delay increases the final cost. Reform may include putting programs on long-term budgets with caps, which would help us better set priorities and make trade-offs between programs. We could rein in program costs by better targeting benefits to those truly in need and bringing more choice and competition into Medicare and Medicaid. We could address the Medicare drug entitlement, which actually faces a long-term shortfall larger than the entire Social Security program, just the Medicare drug entitlement. Limiting the Medicare drug entitlement to low-income seniors would make a significant dent in that shortfall without harming those who really depend on it. To sum up, I've thrown a lot of economics and numbers, but this issue is about more than economics. The important question is whether we're ready for one generation to hand a multi-trillion-dollar retirement bill over to the next generation. In the absence of fundamental reform, the next generation faces much higher lifetime tax rates and lower incomes than their parents. And every year we wait, the cost goes up by trillions of dollars. But it doesn't have to be that way. This is the greatest economic challenge of our era. But we've tackled depressions and world wars. We can surely tackle this too. But only if we roll up our sleeves and work together, old and young, Democrat and Republican, to make the hard but necessary decisions. The time is now.
So I'd just like to let everybody know that after the event, we will be providing professional counseling services for those of you that have some kind of post-traumatic distress disorder. So, and we spiced all the hors d'oeuvres with Prozac, so you should be okay. We have Will Marshall from the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, D.C.
Thanks very much, John, and it's a pleasure to be here at the Baker Institute. Good evening, everyone. I'm making my debut on the Fiscal Hawk Roadshow. This is the first time I've joined this illustrious group. But back in Washington, I'm part of a cross-partisan or post-partisan group of think tanks and analysts who have taken up the cry here. And though we disagree on the stimulus bill, I found out today, we've had some lively debates about that. But on the underlying issue about this debt crisis that we face, they need to get that under control for the economic soundness of our nation, and also, I think, for the moral soundness of it. We all agree, so it's a great pleasure to be here. And I think we can also agree that our new president, Barack Obama, has been dealt a pretty lousy economic hand. He faces a financial market meltdown worse than anything we've seen since the great crash of 1929, a recession that looks to be as deep as any one we've seen since the Second World War, and a burgeoning debt crisis that you've just had laid out for you very vividly. Facing this kind of reality, I would not have blamed Barack Obama if he had called up Rod Blagojevich and offered to buy his old Senate seat back. But he didn't. And instead, I think, and I can't use that line anymore, by the way, because the Illinois Senate today removed Blagojevich from the governor's office. But I think in the last couple of weeks, we've seen an amazing kind of crystallization in the president's mind about the fiscal challenge that we face. I call it fiscal realism. He has understood that the cost of dealing with the present crisis, I actually think the bigger cost and the graver situation is the financial market meltdown and how we stabilize that and get credit unfrozen. But the short-term cost of stabilizing markets and mitigating the severity of this recession are going to be enormous, in the trillions, and they are going to compound our long-term funding, our long-term financing challenge if we don't begin now to put in place mechanisms that will begin to impose fiscal discipline once the economy starts to recover. We have erected, and you've seen it here, I don't have a PowerPoint tonight, I have a book, hopelessly in the Gutenberg Gallery, but we have erected a fiscal doomsday machine in this country. That is, the Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid programs are automatic. They grow every year. There's no democratic deliberation. And they are squeezing out everything that progressives care about. That is, the kind of discretionary investments in children's, the well-being of children, and in early education, and expanding health care, which we think is terribly important, and modernizing our transportation and a smart grid. You name it. All the things that we think we need to invest in to expand the productive capacity of our economy are going to be shoved out by the inexorable growth of these programs which underwrite the consumption of people who are growing older, like me. And that's just bad economics. A society that borrows to underwrite consumption is not making wise choices. If we need to borrow, first of all, we ought to do it like most businesses do, to enhance our productive capabilities so we can generate the growth later on to pay back what we've borrowed. And so we've got to, as a matter of economics, we have to turn this situation around, and as a matter of equity, we have to turn this situation around. I mean, one of the great challenges facing this administration is to reverse the very pronounced trends toward growing inequality that we've seen take hold in our country in the last decade. And so this challenge is related to that. Now, fortunately, President Obama understands this. He's appointed a government performance czar. He's called for a fiscal responsibility summit. He said he wants a grand bargain on entitlement reform. That's a big conceptual breakthrough. For the Democratic Party has not been terribly receptive to the idea that the entitlements are really a deep problem that need to be grappled with. They've resisted that argument, particularly when it came from President Bush and Republicans. But so he has at least rhetorically laid down a very important marker. And he said in his inaugural address that they're going to scrub federal spending, and that they find things that don't contribute to the broader national interest. Programs are going to end. And I think that's a terribly important promise. I've been in Washington for a long time now, and programs seem to achieve immortality. Once they're enacted, it is very difficult to get rid of any of them. We almost never do that. And if he's serious about that, that is really change we can believe in. Now, this is going to be a terribly difficult political challenge for President Obama, but for the whole country. He has to pursue what appear to be on the surface contradictory policies over the next year to 18 months. He's got to say, to borrow an Iraq metaphor here with the Iraq study group having met here, he's got to win support for a fiscal surge now that he thinks is necessary to speed economic recovery and ward off a really catastrophic financial meltdown. But he's also got to show people the exit strategy, the fiscal exit strategy from overspending that we have to embark on once the economy starts to recover. Because, what unites the short-term economic challenge and the long-term economic challenge is the underlying economic problem we face as a country. And it's not because greedy people on Wall Street took undue risks, though they did. It's not because they were over-leveraged, though that's true, or invented exotic derivatives. That's true, too. But the fundamental problem is that we are, as a nation, living beyond our means. Year after year after year, we consume more than we produce and make up the difference by borrowing particularly from Asia and the Persian Gulf. And no nation can get away with that year after year. So the great challenge, I think, and it's going to be a massive cultural transformation, is to move from bailout nation, where we are now and over the next 12 months, to thrift nation. This is a country that has to get back in touch with what Max Weber called the wonderful Protestant ethic. We're going to have to start saving more, consuming less, investing more and financing with our own savings, the kind of borrowing we need to do as a society to expand our productive capacity. And this is going to be a radical cultural transformation for a country that's used to, at the level of the household, at the level of government, and at the level of business, literally live on borrowed prosperity. Finally, there have been a lot of numbers offered to you tonight, and they're pretty grim and they're pretty titanic. It's hard to get your mind around $56 trillion. And it can all seem overwhelming and kind of depressing, and something that you just don't want to think about. It puts me in mind of one of my headline I saw in my favorite satirical magazine, The Onion, which said that the cost of living now exceeds the benefits. Well, I don't think we need despair here. This is a political challenge. Like all political challenges, we can surmount our difficulties if we have the will. This is a preventable calamity. There's nothing inevitable about it, but we do have to lay aside our old ideological baggage. And this is not something we can just fob off on the elected leaders in Washington and say it's all their fault, they won't lead. There's some truth to that, but we have to change too. If we just adopt our assigned positions in the debate, I'm never going to countenance any kind of changes that raise your taxes, or I'm never going to countenance any kind of trimming of benefits and Social Security and Medicare. If we stay in those camps, we will never solve this problem. So as much as I hope that our new president, as much as I think he is going to provide inspired and creative leadership to really change the way we do business in Washington, I think it's ultimately going to be up to us to change the way we think about these problems if we're going to solve them. Thank you very much.
Now we're going to move into the question and answer period. I'll invite you to walk up to the microphones. If you have a question, ask your question. We'll each take a chance to answer it. I am going to take moderator's prerogative to ask the first question. It's a question I like to ask of people, and I just want a number. What is the right size of government given as a percentage of GDP?
Should I?
Do you have an answer?
I would say that from a level of not having a balanced budget, taxes have historically been 18 to 20% of the economy. I would like to be able to keep spending at that level so that we don't have to raise taxes, because I think raising taxes would be harmful. But, I can respect that there'll be different positions on the panel.
Well, John, it's an unanswerable question. I don't think you can arrive at it technocratically. This is a democracy. The answer is what the American people are willing to tax themselves to pay for and to spend. But I will say this, the 18 to 19% of national income that we've traditionally raised in modern times it was a reflection of what Americans were willing to pay for government in the last half century. But we're moving into a new world, a new demographic reality where 1/5 of our population is going to be over 65 as far as we can see into this century. So the size of government for an older country, I think, is going to be different than it was for a younger one.
I think that I agree that there's no particular right size, but the thing that I know is that you can either tax and spend at around 18% of GDP, or you could, if you wanted to, tax and spend around 25% of GDP if you wanted to. What you can't do is tax at 18% of GDP and spend at 25% of GDP, and that's where we're headed. So that's the fundamental issue.
Right now, we tax at 18.5. Before the recent problems, we were spending at about 20.5. Now we're spending higher than that. We're headed 30 plus on autopilot. That doesn't count state and local, which you have to add on top of that. While there is no right number, I would say absent wars, depressions, or serious recessions, 22.
Very well. Our first question will come from right over here.
This is addressed to any of your panelists. Would you back having the federal government set up its budgetary procedures the same way as state and local governments do? The financial situation in Washington is much worse than most people will admit, because we are taking into income monies that are truly trust funds. We treat as income money we borrow. President Bush, in I think 1991, vetoed a bill to increase unemployment benefits because it would increase the deficit. But where do the unemployment benefits come from? Businessmen pay a tax, and that money should have been set up as a trust fund. And when you take money out of trust fund, it is not an expenditure of the government. And certainly with the Social Security, that's the problem. And even though President Clinton did an admirable job of, quote, balancing the budget, if we really treated Social Security and other trust funds as liabilities rather than as income, we have never balanced the budget in probably in the last 100 years or so.
Well, first, I used to be a trustee of Social Security and Medicare from 1990 to 1995. We've balanced the budget on an operating basis one time in the last 40 years. And that means without considering the Social Security surplus. First, I think it was about 2000. Secondly, newsflash, there are no trust funds. All right? Newsflash, there are no trust funds. There's something that the government calls a trust fund. You can't trust it, it's not funded. Okay?
Yeah.
It's a trust the government fund. All right? Now, in fact, if you treated these as real trust funds, people would be in jail. You could not do in the private sector with these trust funds what the government does. All right? Now, while the trust funds are a fiction, false advertising, all right, the bonds aren't. There are bonds that are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. They're guaranteed as to principal interest. They will be honored. But guess what? The government doesn't consider them to be a liability. The government says, well, the left hand owes the right hand, and I say, no, that's wrong. You took the people's money, you spent the people's money, you put back a bond that's guaranteed as principal interest. You will deliver, because it'll be a default if you don't, and therefore it ought to be a liability. Your deficits are a lot higher than you thought. Your debt to GDP is a lot higher than your advertising, and I'm trying to get that changed. So that's the honest to God's truth.
I think that the Social Security Trust Fund masks the size of the problem, because we're taking in more money from workers than needs to be paid out to current beneficiaries. That is the Social Security cash surplus. That money is, of course, credited to the trust fund and then spent on whatever else the government is doing, because we're running a big budget deficit. So it's not a savings device in that sense. And I think it is disingenuous and I think it's not fair to younger workers to be taxing at a higher rate than we need and not actually translating that somehow into national savings. So on paper, the Social Security Trust Fund has enough bonds in it to last until the 2040s sometimes, and that can sound rather comforting until you realize that the cash flows turn negative in about 10 years. And at that point, to pick up on what Dave said, the bonds will be honored, but that, as a practical matter, what that means is that the Social Security Commissioner will go to the Treasury Secretary and say, pay up. So it is one arm of the government owing money to another arm of the government, and the only way the government is going to be able to get the money to honor those bonds is to borrow it from somebody else, or to cut other programs, or raise taxes to pay for it. So I tend to look at the cash flows of that and try to avoid the metaphysics of the trust funds.
Yes. By the way, David, I just wanted to thank you. You really helped me out. My wife and I came here 6 weeks ago, I think it was, when we originally watched this. I was blown away. It really helped me to dive into really understanding and wanting to do research on money itself. And quite honestly, I didn't appreciate history when I went to high school or prior to that, and just barely passed. And I said, shame on me, because here I am 42, and now I get it. And
Can we pause for a second?
The movie
Yep.
is what he's talking
Yeah, he's talking about the movie, the IOUSA movie, which is a kind of just a movie about the tour. It's very informative, and I recommend it to everyone. So.
yeah,
By the
if
way,
you
there's
guys,
a free copy, iousathemovie.com. There's a free 30-minute version on the internet that we gave away at the foundation because it's too important. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the one thing I wanted to ask, and and I do agree with this gentleman here. I mean, you can't pay one debt and pay off another debt, and that's what happened when the admission happened in 2000 that there was no Social Security trust fund. So and I got faked out by that. I felt like I got duped. But one of the things I did wanted to mention, and I want to stick to this. It said, since I did not hear this mentioned in the documentary that we viewed the last time we were here, I wanted to ask: is the Federal Reserve government run, or is it a privately run corporation?
It's quasi-government. It's off the books. There are aspects of what it does that's very important. There are aspects of what it does that arguably are unconstitutional, but nobody's going to challenge it.
Well, you are, and so should we.
Well, I'm talking about nobody's going to challenge the constitutionality of it.
And why not? That's my question.
Yeah.
Why not? David?
Well, let's just put it this way. I think that they are very powerful. There needs to be more transparency.
Yes.
There needs to be more accountability. But at the same point in time, they've done some things recently that, frankly, have probably helped to stem a much bigger problem, but they've done it without people understanding what they did and what the potential consequences are vis-a-vis stoking inflation down the line and other issues.
Well, is it fair to say that the Federal Reserve is somewhat like Fannie and Freddie, not a government institution necessarily, but backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government?
They're different than Freddie. I mean, they're much different than Freddie and Fannie, and they have a role with regard to monetary policy as well as overseeing the financial system. People don't know, they don't understand their role as much with regard to their oversight responsibilities with regard to the financial system, and that's where we've had some problems recently.
Yeah. This actually just leads me to my main thing that I wanted to ask. Since I know your perspective, because I just needed to get that. Knowing this, since Nixon took us off the gold standard back in '71, how then, I'll repeat it again. Since Nixon took us off the gold standard back in '71, how then can we continue printing money that is backed by nothing and expect no bad thing to happen?
Well, the money is backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government.
Yeah, but we can't rely on that. I gotta challenge that, my man. Because I look at my dollar bill.
Yeah, you can challenge it, but that's what it says on the dollar bill.
Yeah, but back in the day, as you guys remember, it used to say silver backed by, demanded on by the bearer, and it's like now we've taken silver or gold, we've taken that off the standard. I watched your documentary, David, and I looked at the very end. All I wanted to find was a solution. And when I saw that pink piggy bank and save money, I'm like, what are we saving for? I mean, quite honestly, what are we really saving for? If it's backed by nothing and we keep on printing more.
Well, I think the bottom line's this, okay? It's not backed by gold. It's not backed by a hard asset. It is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Clearly, that's not the same.
And
as
it's
being
not.
backed by gold or backed by silver, all right? And there's been a diminution of the value of the dollar. But everything in the world is relative, too. You have to look at what our strength is as compared to others. Let's put it this way. Bottom line is this. We need to get our fiscal policy in order. We need to get our monetary situation under control. If we do those two things, the dollar will be stronger and worth more. And if we don't, it'll be weaker and weaker and weaker over time.
It's backed by our ability or our credibility, and that's why it's so important, as Dave said, to have these responsible policies. And if we do, that will be fine. Obviously, one of the dangers in some sort of hypothetical is that the federal government runs enormous budget deficits year after year, trillions of dollars, and resorts to simply printing money to try to inflate your way out of the problem. And obviously that is the wrong way to go. So anyway, so long as that is not happening, I don't think we need to worry about it, but I think that that's all the more reason to get control and to show some discipline now, because we are printing a lot of dollars right now, and we are addressing it through aggressive monetary policy as well as fiscal policy. And I think it's very, very important to show that there is something on the back end of this to exercise fiscal discipline, so people do have faith in the dollar.
But by the way, let me say one last thing. You cannot inflate your way out of the problem that we're talking about. Some people say, well, let's just inflate our way out of it. You can't, because these obligations grow faster than inflation and, in many cases, faster than the economy. You can't. You have to make tough choices.
Okay. Next question.
Hello, Don Chapman. I was curious, there's something that bothers me. It's really tax policy, but I think it enters into fiscal policy, and I wonder if it impacts the things that you've been talking about. And that is that our income tax system as a political matter is getting more and more progressive, and people are being taken off the income tax rolls, a greater percentage of Americans. And if I understand some of President Obama's promises or indications, that number could even become more than 50% people taken off the income tax rolls, so that income taxes would be paid by less than 50% of the population. And I wonder where that would leave us. Already well more than 50%. I think the number is well over 70% of the population pays more in payroll taxes than they do in income taxes. So payroll taxes is becoming a bigger and bigger factor, I suppose, in the financing of the federal government, and that's Social Security, of course. But if fewer people pay income taxes and we try to finance, we think of financing the government mostly by income taxes, where does that leave you politically when you're trying to solve the problems that you're discussing?
Oh, I can jump in first. Say your numbers your points are right. In terms of since 2000, the percent of the percent of income taxes, just income taxes, not counting payroll taxes, but the percent of income taxes paid by the top 20% has gone from 81% of the total share to 86%. And it's not just because of them getting wealthier either. Those thresholds really haven't changed much. And there has been a decrease of taxes at the bottom. And so in that way, the tax code has become more progressive in terms of the actual payment since 2000. The challenge there is I think a lot of people are comfortable with the progressivity of it. I think a lot of people believe that it's a good thing to have it be that progressive, and I think that's just a question of political values. One of the economic impacts of having that progressivity is that the tax revenues are actually more volatile now, because you're getting more of the tax revenues from the people at the top, and their incomes really fluctuate from booms to recessions. And so that's one of the reasons we saw revenues go way up in the late 90s and then way down after the 2001 recession. Then they went way up again, and now revenues are going way down again, in part because the more you get from the people at the top who can make $10 million one year and a lot less the next year when the economy tanks, if their income is more volatile than the people making $50,000 a year, you have more volatility in total tax revenues. In terms of the political dynamic, this is something we have to decide as a country. If we want a higher tax burden, to pay for entitlements, which is a legitimate argument to make, we do have to decide how much we can concentrate that just on the top. Even though a lot of people are more comfortable with tax increases for the people at the top than tax increases for the bottom, there's only so much you can put it on one group of people before the rate gets high enough to have negative economic consequences. Other people have also pointed out political consequences. I think that there are some people who are concerned about if the tax burden is too concentrated on a minority of the population, and then you have another group of the population that's not paying as much in taxes but is receiving more of the benefits that alter their relationship with the government and the way they vote. I think those are legitimate debates to have, and I think the government, to the extent that we're going to raise tax rates as a partial solution to this, that's something we're going to have to deal with. How much do we want to have the tax burden on the top versus at the bottom? I'm not offering a right or wrong answer, but I think it's a very important issue.
Well, first, the person who's asking this question used to be Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for tax policy, so he's pretty knowledgeable about this. Don, it's good to see you again. He is correct in saying that a majority of Americans pay more in payroll taxes than income taxes, and they both come out of your paycheck, and they both reduce your disposable income. And so when you look at total tax burdens, I think you have to look at all taxes. Although I will tell you, I would be troubled if half of Americans didn't pay any income taxes. We need a progressive taxation, but you need to keep in mind that Social Security, by definition, is designed to provide higher replacement rates for people who are less well off and higher tax burdens for people who are better off. And so I think it creates some perverse incentives to where, it can move people towards saying, gee, I want more, especially if I don't have to pay very much. And so I think that's a problem. And my personal view is our tax system has gone a long way in the wrong direction since 1986, where we tried to streamline, simplify, broaden the base, keep the rates low. Last year alone, I heard there were 500 changes in the tax code, and I think time has come to try to come up with something that's a little bit more rational and sustainable.
That's right. I think the 33% that currently don't pay taxes, and there's one estimate that it'd be 44% under Obama during the campaign. I think that's gone up to around 50. That's mainly because of spending through the tax system. So tax expenditures, the child tax credit and things like that, in which lower income people's tax liability just gets wiped out, and then you add on refundable tax credits, which then they not only get wiped out, but then they get mailed a check. That sort of thing is a problem. It's a problem for both low-income people and high-income people. I personally am not a fan of tax expenditures and spending through the tax system. So, Will?
Well, I just have to say, Obama has famously concentrated his ideas about tax relief on the middle class. It's true that some of the tax expenditures will marginally reduce the number of low-income people who are subject to income tax, but let's not worry, they're still paying plenty of payroll tax, which will only go up if we don't solve the problems that we're talking about today. So most people are being hit heavily by a steeply regressive tax on labor through the payroll tax, and it seems to me that we want a more progressive tax code because it's a market-friendly, less interventionist way to work against the tendencies toward inequality that we've seen get worse in the society. In fact, we are now talking about greater degrees of inequality in this country than at any time since the 1920s. And one virtue, there's several virtues of a progressive tax code, but one virtue of a progressive tax code is that it adjusts for these inequalities after market outcomes, rather than trying to direct those market outcomes or produce outcomes that some social engineer thinks are more fair or more progressive. So it seems to me it's always been a valuable way to maintain a kind of broad middle-class democracy and popular confidence in that democracy, and that we shouldn't be undermining progressivity. The real problem is the thing is riddled with loopholes, complexities, unwarranted, with $900 billion worth of tax expenditures aimed at, frankly, corporate welfare that should go before we start worrying that some low-income people aren't paying enough income tax.
On the Social Security point, I mean, the Social Security taxes, the Social Security system The Social Security system, it's a system, there's a tax and a benefit. The total system is progressive. So you can't separate the Social Security tax from the benefits people that they're going to receive. It's just a savings system. It's a forced government savings. So I don't buy the argument that the low-income people are paying plenty in taxes through the Social Security system. That's not true. They're just saving for retirement, and they're going to get a very generous benefit when they retire. I do agree that tax expenditures are a huge problem. I also don't agree that inequality is really affected by the tax system. I don't think the tax system is a good way to implement equitable distribution of wealth. I think what you see if you look across countries is that wealthy people tend to pay a very steady percentage of their income in taxes, whether income tax rates are high or low. In fact, we're paying about the same percentage now as they paid in the late 70s, early 80s when income taxes were much higher, 70 to 80%. So what you have is they're just much more efficient at avoiding taxes, although the process of avoiding taxes is a very inefficient use of resources. So I do think that inequality is a big problem, and I think what's driving it is increased globalization and increased competition from abroad, and I definitely think that we have to address that. And he obviously disagrees, but that's why we're economists.
One thing on the Social Security taxes is those transfers do take place at different times, so that the payroll tax is going to hit workers now. Now they get a better return on that when they retire sometime later, but the immediate economic impact of the payroll tax on a worker is taking place now, and then they'll get the benefit sometime
just
later
like
down
savings.
the road.
Yeah. Just like if you're saving money. They're saving money for retirement through a forced government program. Next question.
Thank you all for coming to town, and I hope you enjoy your time in Houston. And thank you all for being leaders on this issue. My question is, are there any leaders in Congress? Specifically, are there any leaders in Congress who are addressing in any kind of systemic way the problem of budget deficits? Anything along the line, any people in Congress or any proposals that are out there? Is there anything that's being realistically discussed by members of Congress to try to deal with this situation?
Not enough, but yes. And I'll give you 4 names, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, who are proposing legislation that would establish an extraordinary process where everything would be on the table: taxes, entitlement reform, healthcare reform, etc., for an up or down vote in Congress to force decisions on this. In the House, Jim Cooper, Democrat, Tennessee; Frank Wolf, Republican, Northern Virginia. In the Senate, Kent Conrad, Democrat, North Dakota; Judd Gregg, Republican, New Hampshire. So that's even Steven, both sides of the hill.
I think you were next.
Hi, this has been a very informative session. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for providing this opportunity. Thank you very much. You know, we've talked a lot about fiscal policy and monetary policy, and I understand you're a panel of economists. But my mind... Get closer.
Not one, don't want to be one, but that's okay.
Sorry. It's too tall. I'm short. I know we're talking about fiscal policy and monetary policy, but what I think about when I think about healthcare, I think about we're a country that we're free to be 500 pounds if we want to, but when we go to school, when we're young, we have sodas and French fries and whatnot. And when we tried to change these things, the food lobby came out so hard against it that it shut it down in a lot of places, even though it was for the better public good. And when I think about Social Security reform, I think about the fact that companies don't have to take on pensions and retirements as a liability if they go bankrupt. You know, they do have to take equipment and buildings and whatnot, but the well-being of our elderly don't go on their liability sheet. And so my question is, don't you think that we should stop talking so much about government responsibility and start also talking about corporate responsibility, and that their sole goal is to make money when in fact maybe they should be required to have some kind of social responsibility so we wouldn't have so many of these problems.
I certainly agree with that, and let me just say, President Obama today had a colloquy at the White House with Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, when he said, you know, the big Wall Street trading houses issued $20 billion in bonuses in the last year. Now, was this a good year on Wall Street? I can't remember. No, I think it melted down. We don't even have a lot of the big trading houses. They don't exist anymore. So despite a spectacularly abysmal performance, they found a way to enrich themselves with $20 billion worth of bonuses at the very time that they're looking to the government to bail them out from the effects of their cupidity and foolishness. So yes, we can't, we can't solve any of our problems without a kind of ethic of sobriety and responsibility returning to the business and financial sector that's been noticeably missing lately.
I also think, though, that individual responsibility is important, too. We have to do a better job saving ourselves from our own income for our own retirement and health care. Social Security was never designed to provide 100% of retirement income. I think there's a lot we can do in order to do a better job of providing for our own. And there's decisions on whether or not it should be provided by businesses or individuals. There's a trade-off. I mean, sometimes if businesses provide more benefits, it results also in lower salary. They just take your compensation that you would have gotten in salary and put it into benefits. Certain people prefer to have the benefits. Certain people prefer to have the higher salary in order to invest it themselves. They're both are fine. But the important thing is we can't depend on the government necessarily to finance all of our retirement costs because they don't have the money. One thing that President Obama has talked about, which I like, is more auto IRAs, where people who do not have access to 401ks who get jobs would be automatically enrolled into an IRA, and then they would have to opt out of it. Anybody would be free to opt out of it, but instead of you having to take the initiative to opt in, they automatically, your employer would automatically enroll you in an IRA, and you just would ask to opt out. That has increased in the past with people who've looked into this, the utilization rate very high without taking away anybody's right to opt out anytime they want. That's one thing that can help people take a lot more individual initiative in saving for their retirement and health care as well.
There's a leadership deficit in all sectors of the economy. There's a leadership deficit in government, in the private sector, and in other sectors. Corporations, a significant majority of corporations offer health care for active workers. Only about 15% of corporations offer retiree health care for workers. And about 50% of full-time workers are offered private pension plans. To the extent that those are offered, they are liabilities on the books of corporations. But corporations have fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders. They should be good community citizens, and they should care about the strength of their communities as well as, the strength of the country and the education of the workforce, because over time, if they don't remain strong, they will pay an adverse consequence. But frankly, one of the problems we have today is people don't look very far out ahead. Most corporate executives look to the next quarter. Most politicians look to the next election. Most teenagers look to the next weekend. Either one of them is too short to really deal with some of the challenges we have. So yes, we need more corporate responsibility, but don't misunderstand one thing. Companies do not have duties of loyalty to countries. They have duties of loyalty to their shareholders. But they will be focused first and foremost. They need to be more socially aware, but they will be focused first and foremost on two things, rightly or wrongly: grow the top line, minimize expenses, maximize the bottom line. Which means that in a global marketplace, we're going to face increasing competition because we're not the only place that has knowledgeable workers, and because there are other places that the cost of operations are a lot less than here. And so we better start focusing on our education system. We better start focusing on our infrastructure. We better start focusing on basic research if we want to stay competitive.
I think it's important to remind ourselves, Social Security and Medicare are social insurance programs. They're paid for. We all pay in and get something out. They are the government's contribution to the, I shouldn't say the government's contribution, but the government portion of a retirement security portfolio that should include private savings and company pensions and health care plans. Now, as we all know, those three stools are changing quite a bit as companies pull back some of their coverage or switch to defined contribution plans instead of defined benefit plans. But what we're talking about with the government social insurance program is an unsustainability problem, which is a problem for all of us and is separate from the issue of how corporations treat their workers, what pensions, what benefits they're offered, and also separate from the way that the individuals save or don't save for their retirement and health care expenditures. So to concentrate on, or to, when we talk about the future gaps in Social Security and Medicare, it's not to suggest that people don't have an obligation to save for themselves, or that corporations don't have an obligation to provide benefits negotiated with their workers. But it is to point out that that part of it, that third of the three-legged stool, is on shaky grounds and needs to be firmed up for the future, particularly if it's going to take on, particularly as it's being asked to take on more of a role as individuals don't save enough and companies are pulling back some of that. So that's our concentration on it, not to ignore the other elements.
Okay, we'll go to the next. Were you next? Okay. Y'all, if y'all want to sit in those chairs, I'll remember your order so you don't have to stand up so long.
Yes, I'm Judy Allen.
Judy?
I have two comments and then a challenge and a question to you all. First, I want to say that I think every American ought to be thrilled that the Federal Reserve is not part of the United States government, but is an independent entity, which I served for 11 years on a board in Houston and in Dallas. It is in no way similar to Fannie and Freddie. So I just want to clarify that for you.
Right on point.
The second thing I want to say is how strongly I disagree with Mr. Marshall's view of what should happen to our income tax, because when you cut off the desire to farm your own small company because the numbers don't work, because the government is going to take too much to make you want to work, then you sit at home and wait for the government to take care of you, which we can't afford as we stand here today. Now, my question to you, and starting with Mr. Marshall, who said that we should all try to look, get outside of our own boxes and everybody work together. I want to hear from each of you, what is your meaningful cut that you would make in a government program that exists today? And I mean meaningful. Mr. Marshall?
Well, thank you. We have, if you go on the PPI website, you'll find long target list of government programs we would like to cut. And since the mid-90s, we have developed a list of tax expenditures, again, now totaling $900 billion, that we think we should institute a base closing style commission to run through and then present to Congress on an up or down vote a list for elimination or dramatic reduction. So
what I want to hear is what you've now been elected a senator. What would you propose to cut personally? You know the government. You've worked for a lot of Democrats. What would you cut? I can give you my version, but I want to hear yours.
Well, as I said, I'm giving you my version. I would cut those.
A specific program.
Well, there are like 100 of them on our website.
Well, give me one.
Well, I'll give you one that's relevant to our topic tonight, since I know Bob likes to bring it back to the areas of consensus on this thing. In this book that I mentioned earlier on, we endorse the idea of progressive indexing of Social Security benefits. You're not going to like this, but the idea is that we should restrain benefits for taxpayers who are, for retirees who are well off.
Oh, I agree with that. No, that's
okay.
All right.
So
what would that produce? How much money?
It depends on how you design it.
Well, just real simple. Is that a $300 billion over 10 years? Is it a $30 billion over 10 years?
It cuts the shortfall in half, according to Bob Posen's calculations.
Okay, that's your cut.
Let me first say, I'm from the Heritage Foundation, so the question of what wouldn't I cut would actually...
With you. Yeah, I agree.
I mean, I would
what
cut
tax
a lot.
would you raise?
That's the challenging question. And furthermore, I think what I wouldn't cut, I would devolve to state and local governments because I think they're more accountable, other than things that can't be devolved. But to keep it, let's keep it in the entitlement discussion. Medicare Part B and D premiums. Right now, when you pay your payroll tax from Medicare, your payroll tax only pre-funds Medicare Part A, which is hospital insurance. Your payroll tax does not pre-fund Medicare Part B or Medicare Part D. You don't pay into the system, you don't earn your benefits, and your premium only covers 25% of the cost. So what that means is that when you buy into Medicare Part B and Medicare Part D, the taxpayers pay 3/4 and the senior citizen pays 1/4. Now, that's okay for low-income seniors who can't afford to pay more. But Warren Buffett only pays 1/4 of his Medicare B and Medicare Part D premium.
That's not true. There's a supplement in there based upon your income.
Very, very small. It gets up to 20, I think it gets up to 25, 26, 28, 29% of it. They don't pay more than a quarter or slightly over a quarter of their premium. Bill Gates is only going to end up paying about 25% of his Medicare Part D and Medicare Part D premium. I think that's a very large subsidy, I think, that should be means tested. I mean, look, we live in a country where 40 million people don't have health care, but multimillionaires are going to get 3/4 of their Medicare B and D subsidies paid for by the taxpayers. I can't think of a way that makes sense. So I think one of the ways to reform Medicare would be to ask seniors who are a little wealthier to pay a little more than 25, 26, 27, 28% of their Medicare B and D premiums. And that would save a lot of money.
I think that sounds like an idea worth pursuing. Mr. Bixby?
We have a new moderator.
We've endorsed that. I'll see that and raise you a hike in the retirement age, the standard retirement age, from 67 to 69, spread out over 30 years or so.
Why don't you make it higher to 71 or 2? Look how vigorous people are as
I
they
think
get
maybe
older.
I can get away with raising it to 69, but I don't know if I can to 70, so I'm trying to be politically
feasible. Well, Mr. Marshall says we should all get together and, all work together, so I bet we could get him
That's
to
why I'm
sign
keeping
on.
it to 69. But look, I mean, the point is that we need to raise the eligibility age because
Absolutely.
The program is fundamentally different than it was when it was demographics are fundamentally different when the program was instituted.
Great ideas, you all. What about Mr. Walker?
All right, on the tax side, because I think you have to look at the tax side too. We spend $250 billion a year in foregone tax revenues because very few individuals pay income tax or payroll tax on employer-provided and paid health care. Provided and paid. In other words, the employer gets a deduction, but whatever the value of that is that they pay on your behalf, you don't pay income tax on it, you don't pay payroll tax on it, all right? That's $250 billion a year. It's the fastest growing tax preference. Now, what does that mean? If you're a CEO for a private sector company, top marginal tax rate, lucrative health care plan, the taxpayers subsidize your health care big time. If you are in a small business, near poor, working, don't have any health insurance, you get no subsidy. I would significantly scale back the tax preferences for health care such that you might have a basic and essential level that is tax-free, but above that, you pay income tax. It's a tremendous amount of money.
Above that, the corporation pays?
No, the individual pays. The individual needs to pay because the individual gets the benefit and needs to be more sensitive to the cost of the benefit.
Yeah.
We have to target tax preferences and target taxpayer subsidies to a much greater extent than we have. It's hundreds of billions a year.
That's a good.
Let me just kind of put this all together by saying if you actually did all of the things we're recommending on Social Security and Medicare, you'd pretty much close virtually the entire Social Security shortfall, maybe slightly less than that, and you could probably take out a significant portion of the Medicare shortfall as well if you just did these things.
Well, why don't we call Mr. Marshall's friend Obama and tell him that we've solved the problem?
One problem.
Well, those are great ideas. All right, Mr. Diamond.
I think those are such great ideas. We'll go on. I would say. Next question.
All right, I'm a little bit upset because she kind of stole my question, but I'm just going to modify it slightly.
Okay.
I like to say Generation Y, or the people born in the late 70s and early 80s, are getting ready to move into leadership of our country. We're getting ready to move into the lower management, middle management. A lot of people in my generation are starting to think about where are we going to be in 10 years? What roles can we take to help out? And my question to you is, we've been talking a little bit about leadership deficit. It's been mentioned once or twice. And whether you're a Republican or Democrat, I refuse to believe that the people that we have right now are the best that this country has to offer. And so what I'm going to ask you is, if you were elected right now, Republican or Democrat, senator or a House of Representatives congressman, what would you do to help fix some of this leadership deficit that we have? And what is our way forward for the leadership deficit?
Well, we spent last year running around Iowa and New Hampshire, and nobody ever mistook us for candidates after they heard what we had to say. If I were miraculously elected to something and had been telling the truth during the campaign, I think what I would try to do is encourage my fellow members of whatever body I was elected to join me in doing town hall meetings back in their districts concentrating on this. And there was, a few years ago, there was a group that formed around a Social Security reform plan that was led by Charlie Stenholm of Texas and Colby, I forget his...
Jim Colby.
Jim Colby of Arizona. They formed this mutual protection pact where they pledged that if somebody came in and ran against them on the Social Security issue, they would come to their district to protect them. So it was a sort of a bipartisan protection pact that the sponsors of this group of this particular reform plan agreed to adhere to. I think that's the sort of thing that I would want to try to do, is encourage people to talk about it publicly. And I had an opportunity to talk to a recently elected member of the Senate, and it was a very frustrating experience because we were making a presentation like this, and this person, who shall remain nameless, said that, well, we just can't, I hear this all the time, we can't talk about it. If I went out and talked about this to my constituents, I'd lose. The other side would lie about this issue. And we were quite frustrated, and I said basically to him, well, then why are you here? I mean, if you're telling me that there's a problem that you can see exists, but you're not going to talk about it, what are you doing in public life? I mean, and well, the other side's going to lie about it. I said, well, fight back with the truth. I mean, and you got nothing, I mean, if all you care about is winning the office, that's fine. But that's what we, I'd try to install some courage in my fellow leaders.
I think we have a dysfunctional democracy. And I think that we have a republic that's not representative of the public. And I think while we have some good people in Washington now, we have too many professional politicians. And that's a problem. Okay? And so I think we have to change the system. It's more fundamental than what Bob said. You got to change the system. And I think you need probably at least 3 changes. Number one, you need to change how we do redistricting to get out of the hands of politicians who protect their party and protect incumbents, no matter what their party is. Secondly, you need to limit how much money you can spend from people who can't vote for you. And thirdly, we need longer, say 18-year term limits. It's got to be long enough to where you have some institutional memory or whatever. Some states have had it too short to where basically you turn it over to the staff. You need to have enough, but we should not have professional politicians, in my view. I think that's part of the problem. That's not what the Founding Fathers intended. I don't think it's good for the Republic.
Well, I don't know how a modern, postmodern, complicated society like ours has citizen legislators, so I guess I can't quite go that far. But the first 2 things that you said, I strongly agree with. In fact, the first chapter in our book says you've got to break the culture in Washington, and it's a transactional culture, so you have to, I think, go to some kind of scheme of public financing. This probably won't be a popular idea in here, but if you really want to reduce the power of special interests to block change in Washington, you've got to sever the cord between their interest in and campaign contributions. You just can't get around it. For 28 years, I've watched this, and it's a bipartisan phenomenon. It's just not, both sides are equally guilty. But what interest groups can't order up legislative outcomes that they want, but they can block things. That's why programs become immortal. Once they're on the books, client groups grow around them, and you can never get rid of them, and you can never really fundamentally reform them. That's why we always layer new reforms atop old reforms rather than get rid of the old ones. So I think that's a very important change. The second change, as Dave said, is competitive, nonpartisan redistricting. You all know something about partisan redistricting here in Texas, but you got to draw these lines not just by kind of bipartisan or nonpartisan commissions. You have to draw them with competition in mind. You have to say, I want more competitive districts. I want more close districts. I want more of a battle, tighter, more contested races. So we've been pushing that idea, and the reason you need that is because redistricting is a powerful reinforcer of polarization, of the kind of zero-sum mentality that dominates in Washington. If you go, the average House member on either side defines his or her job not as solving your problems, but as winning, beating the other side. That's the name of the game. How do we all get together and beat them in a vote? And we've got to break that. And I have to say this about my friend Barack Obama, as you nicely put it. He's made an effort. He's gone over across the aisle and talked. It didn't succeed. Got 0 votes from Republicans on his bill. Okay, maybe they had principal reasons for being against it. The point is, he's trying to create an open channel of communication. He's trying to say, we got to get back to comedy and talking to each other and away from this terrible dynamic of, only one of us can win at one time. So to me, that's a very promising commitment that he's made, and I'm looking for signs on the other side that it's going to be reciprocated.
And maybe the other side's looking for more than talk, maybe some action. Last question of the night.
Like they did.
Good evening. Hi, I'm Melanie Eads, and I want to thank all of you. I've really enjoyed this evening. I want to get back to the debate that Mr. Diamond and Mr. Marshall were having regarding inequality in this country. I think we all can agree that there's certainly inequality, and possibly improving our education system can help with that. But I do have one statement for Mr. Marshall. There should be equality and opportunity, but there will never be equality in outcome. And you can't take from one and give to another and make things equal. People have different drives, different ambitions. So there should be equality and opportunity, but there will never be equality in outcome.
Well, I'm going to take that one. You're preaching to the choir. You can go on our website again and find that sentiment repeated. Our motto at PPI is the old Andy Jackson the Jacksonian democracy war cry, which was equal opportunity for all, special privilege for none. We take that very seriously and try to apply it all the way out. And so we've never been for transfer policies that are trying to engineer equal outcomes. I do think the progressive income tax was erected by that great radical Woodrow Wilson, to pay for a government that had gotten too big and too sophisticated to be paid for by tariff revenues maintained by our protectionist friends. And this is a system that the country thrived under economically. Small businesses do just fine under progressive tax code. Thank you very much. And moreover, Americans think it's fair and they think it's right, and they've rebelled against the regressive features in tax policy of the last decade, and that's one of the reasons Barack Obama is in the White House today. So I don't need that lecture, really. We understand that is what you're trying to do, but you've got to create a political economy that really invests in equal outcomes in education, that closes the achievement gap. You've got to create new market rules that umpire our markets, because we can't leave it to the actors who did such a wonderful job in our financial markets. So we're not trying to. There are not many Marxists. I mean, the only socialists are now the banks, who all want to sell themselves to the federal government so they can get subventions to make their balance sheets look better. It's not really coming from our side.
I'll also take the education question on. I think that's probably I think that may be one of the most important challenge we face. When you hear statistics like 55% of the high school students drop out of school by the time they're 19 in the inner cities. I think economics has a very clear answer on this. It's not race. It's not spend more money. It's lumping large amounts of low-income students together. It doesn't matter what race they are. When you have homogeneous income across, schools that have a homogeneous income level, the high-income schools are going to do well. The low-income schools are going to do very poorly. This has been true since Brown. I mean, in an article by Brown in 1968. We need to do better at having heterogeneous income mixes in our schools. We've got to get some of these kids, going. We can't have 55% dropping out. I mean, that's disastrous. It's only going to exacerbate the Social Security problems, because what we need to pay for these benefits is highly skilled workers who make lots of money and pay lots of payroll taxes, not low-skilled workers that don't make much money and don't pay much in payroll taxes. So I think that is a critical issue, and I think I agree. I think Obama was definitely won the White House because he wanted a less progressive tax system. So he offered to cut 95% of the people's taxes and just raise it on 5%. I don't think progressive taxation is really that big of an issue. The tax code is progressive. 33% of the people don't pay anything, or they get money back. The top 20% pay 86% of the taxes. If that's not progressive, then I don't know what the definition of progressive is.
One more person have a question.
One more question, since we have a little time left. 5 minutes.
I had a couple of comments, and then if you're going to rob Peter to pay Paul, you'll always have Paul support. And I feel like Peter. I said, if you're going to rob Peter to pay Paul, you'll always have the support of Paul. With regard to the Federal Reserve, I think it was started in 1913.
Right.
And
income tax.
I've heard that a dollar in 1913 is worth about a nickel today. Nice job, Fed. And lastly, I think that personally, I feel like the greatest threat to the freedom and prosperity of my family and my countrymen is the federal government. So people that place their trust in the federal government have a lot more confidence in these people than I do.
Actually, may I say something?
One question, yes, you may.
Okay, it's not really a question. It's just you all have talked about in terms of what happens with the economy and the government, all of that. There's a big disconnect that hasn't really been addressed, which is between the American people who don't feel at all connected to what happens in government. They don't feel that government really represents them, relates to them, impacts them. It is a separate entity that functions out there and is good for a soundbite here or there, but it's not real to too many people. And that seems to me to be a huge distance to cross if you really want your interests and your programs and your redefining how we view the future. They have to meet somewhere where you have to get the American people to get halfway across that bridge to meet what you all want to do. And I think it has to be done.
Well, first let me say that the three most important words in the Constitution are the first three. We the people. We the people are responsible and accountable for what does or does not happen. If people don't take the time to become informed and involved, then we deserve what we get. And we're not getting much right now. We got a real problem right now, okay? And so we have a responsibility as citizens to become informed and involved. At the same point in time, the kind of challenges that we face are huge. We're going to need major changes by government, major changes by individuals. And in order to be successful in doing that, Washington's going to have to operate differently. Washington's going to have to go outside of Washington. Washington's going to actually have to engage with the people. You know, tell the truth to them. Talk to them about options. Hear what they have to say. Craft potential solutions and then do something. And that's why I think that one of the things that we're going to have to do is create an action-oriented commission that is comprised of elected officials, one or two members of the administration, several people who aren't government officials, who are credible, who are knowledgeable, who will go outside of Washington, engage in major citizen education and engagement activities, leverage the internet, leverage digital technology, come back with some options, and force a vote, because Washington has been delaying and denying far too long.
Yeah, I think it's really, you know, people will say that they want to get the government out of their lives, but first write the Social Security check and the Medicare check and educate my children and defend my country and fix the roads outside my house and, oh, by the way, cut my taxes. I think that, you know, we all need to have a better, just keep in mind the trade-offs involved with all these things. The federal budget deficit and the debt are things that do seem abstract to people, and it's hard to bring it home. But the activities of the federal government affect us on a daily basis in programs like Medicare and Social Security, and certainly taxes, and all sorts of other ways. They affect the state budgets, and so this really is, I mean, the reason that you need to be concerned about this, and all of us need to do a good job about this, we were talking about this before, is that it affects everybody's interest. If your interest is low taxes, we can't keep low taxes if we keep the current federal spending on autopilot as we have it. The numbers don't add up. If you're interested in investments, domestic investments, whether it's in education or infrastructure, we're not going to be able to do that because we're going to have run up so much debt, and other programs are taking, these programs on autopilot are taking up so much of the money. If you're worried about deficits, as I do, and you're worried about the debt burden on future generations, obviously that's a problem. So whatever your perspective, whatever your primary interest, keeping our current policies on autopilot and running these budget deficits is going to guarantee defeat. And that's why we all have to charge through like Paul Revere here with optimism, not with gloom and doom, with the expectation that we can make things better and that we must make things better, because what we're trying to achieve here is a better outcome for future generations. And that's the spirit that we need to tackle this thing in.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming out, and we hope you enjoyed the Fiscal Wake Up Tour, and have a great night.